On September 3rd, 2022, around 6:30 p.m. in Tehran, a 22-year-old woman was taken into custody by the Gashdalar Shad, the morality police. She was brought to a detention center and placed in a re-education class. There, Gina Masa Amini was to be instructed on how to wear a hijab in accordance with Iranian Sharia law. 26 minutes later, under suspicious circumstances, she collapsed. She was taken to a hospital and died on September 16th. Protests sprung up in Iran and spread across the country, escalating into calls to overthrow their Islamic government. Protesters and authorities clashed, resulting in the deaths of perhaps 75 officials and perhaps around 500 protesters. Tens of thousands were arrested. The protests quieted, and life in modern Iran continued on. Turmoil itself is nothing new in Iran. As one historian put it, Iran is perhaps one of the most invaded and most revolution-prone countries in world history. For its thousands of years of tumult, for better or for worse, Iran has seen it all. Again, as another historian put it, a visiting Martian wanting to see the full range of human activity, good and bad, to understand mankind, could well look at Iran as a kind of introductory course. Iran, I would add, seems to me to be about as interesting as it is misunderstood. Iran's morality police might seem like a small subject within all that, but the policing of morals happens on a much grander scale in Iran than what you might see in terms of patrolling bands. It's a concept central to the very core of Iran's Islamic government, and one you need to understand Iran and its politics today. We're going to concern ourselves with moral policing on that grand scale and give you the context you need to understand it. Context regarding the religion behind it, which is, of course, Islam, and historical context. The context that led to and informs the drama that you see in Iran today. We're going to start by winding the clock back, probably a little farther back than you think, all the way back to around 2000 BCE Mesopotamia, to the founding myth of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. As the story goes, a sheep herder named Abraham was spoken to by God. God told Abraham that if he trusted in his existence and was a loyal devotee, Abraham and his heirs, in return, would receive immense God-given rewards. From that myth sprouted the three great Abrahamic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Though they may use different names and not always be aware of it, they all share the same God. Where they differ is in believing who the heirs of God's promise are, each typically believing that it is they and they alone. All three religions believe that God has delivered a final message to humanity, but each differ in their beliefs of when and where that message was delivered. Jews believe that God spoke to humanity in only one era of human history, all the way back in antiquity, as told in the Torah. Christians believe that God delivered a second message in the form of his Son on earth, Jesus, while Muslims believe that a third and final message was delivered to a businessman in 7th century Arabia named Muhammad. They believe that the message was first delivered by an angel that spoke God's unedited speech that was then delivered to humanity in more or less unedited form by Muhammad. That message, assembled together, is the Quran. So Muslims believe that the words of the Quran are quite literally God's speech, which gives the contents of the Quran for Muslims an unusual power not found comparably in Christianity with the Bible, or in Judaism with the Torah, which were both to a greater degree, as it's usually believed, interpreted and written by humans. The message that God tells humanity in the Quran is that it is He who has created heaven and earth, and created Adam and Eve as the first humans, and it is He who will therefore judge His creation, judge humanity based on their behavior. Adam's fall from heaven in the Quran is not seen as a sin, but rather an error in judgment, and has not tainted the human race with its consequences. So there is no original sin that needs to be purged in Islam. Humans have no inherent wrong, but must instead focus on retaining their purity by living their life as God wills it. What God demands of humanity in the Quran, at the very most basic level, is twofold. On one hand, what is needed is belief in the one true God. And on the other, what is needed is submission to the will of God. So Islam in Arabic means to submit, and to be a Muslim means to be one who submits to the will of God. As God articulates his will in the Quran, what gradually unfolds is essentially a series of directions that regulate human behavior, a list of concrete human acts that tells one how to live and how not to live in order to be in accordance with God's will. Those who follow God's will are moral and will be rewarded in this life and in heaven. Those who disbelieve in God and his message will be punished by God eternally in hell. In contrast to some other religious practices, Islamic morality is something that applies to everyone, at least in theory, regardless of whether you choose to opt in or out of it. It's a message that Muslims believe God revealed to all of humanity, and it's a message that you're either aware of or you're not. But there isn't moral room in Islam to disagree with it, or with the commands that God wills. So, unlike some other religious practices that tend to impose their morality on a more voluntary basis, Islam tends to impose its morality in the form of law applicable to everyone, at least in theory, that its political authority extends over. On that note, the concept of law is so important and inherently close to Islam itself that early Islam made no distinction between law and religion, and Islamic scholarship focuses, most characteristically, not on theology, but on that law. Islamic law, expressed as a whole systematic body, is called the Sharia. It's contentious to name any one singular passage in the Quran that's the basis for the Sharia, but I'll read a famous one that, for our purposes, will do. First, it calls for Muslims to come together as a community on the basis of Islam. Hold fast, it says, all of you together to the cable of Allah, and do not separate. And then it calls for that group of Muslims to impose their morality within that society. As it says, and there may spring from you a nation who invite to goodness and enjoin right conduct and forbid indecency. Such are they who are successful. The command to enforce morality there is a major one in Muslim theory, and is typically translated as commanding right and forbidding wrong. Now remember that Muslims believe this is literally the word of God telling them to do this. They believe God has commanded them to see to it that morally correct behavior occurs, and also to see to it that morally wrong behavior is forbidden. It's a duty that applies to both Muslim men and Muslim women. As it says, and the believers, men and women, are protecting friends of one another. They enjoin the right and forbid the wrong, and they establish worship and they pay the poor due, and they obey Allah and his messenger. As for these, Allah will have mercy on them. Lo, Allah is mighty, wise. So while there is a concrete unit in Iran known as the Morality Police, you could say that the concept of policing morals is a general one in Islamic culture, even if it's controversial how exactly to interpret it. The general goal for Muslims is to create a society that puts into practice God's desires for the human race as they see it. A society where morally right behavior, at least to some extent, is commanded, and morally wrong behavior, again at least to some extent, is forbidden. An area where Muslim morality is dominant is called in Islamic theory an abode of Islam, and Muslims believe they have a God-given duty to enforce their morality within that abode. But they also have a duty to spread their morality in areas where it's not yet dominant in a process called a jihad, which is a word that refers to the expenditure of effort. What exactly it means beyond that is again controversial. Some passages describe a jihad as overtly violent, while others describe it as a more benign process, and yet more, disavow aggression. On that note, the Quran is a long text and is full of contradictions, making it difficult to discern its precise divine intent. Furthermore, the book is heavily dedicated to establishing the principle of monotheism, which was in contrast to the polytheism, which was popular in Arabia during Muhammad's time. Only about 10% of it directly deals with legislating human behavior, and even much of that has to do with religious duties and rituals. Only a small fraction of the Quran provides rules for social relations and for community life. To establish a more comprehensive set of principles to live by, Muslims looked to Muhammad as an example of God's living will, which meant that his actions, his words, and his deeds were canonized and set as the highest example for Muslims to imitate. From the smallest details of his life, even something so small as his opinion on pumpkin as a food, all the way up to his grandest deeds, such as his spreading of Islam across Arabia in his time. Muhammad's actions, Muslims believe, were actions that expressed ideal human behavior as seen by God. But even then, Muhammad lived in the 6th and early 7th century AD, and his life, even combined with the Quran, couldn't give comprehensive guidance for Muslims in the years going forward. Muslims' attempts to deal with that disparity has caused rifts between various Islamic sects, with major disagreements about leadership and succession, and about what Muslim values should and should not be, and how Muslim societies should be structured. But even within that, some common sources of guidance emerged. One major source was simply Muslim tradition, forming a sort of rough consensus on Muslim behavior over the centuries. Another major, and you could say more active source of guidance, came from the ulama, the learned religious scholars, who again traditionally mostly concern themselves with law. But the legal scholars can still more specifically be called the fuqaha. These legal scholars, at the highest levels of Muslim hierarchies, are respected for their ability to interpret Muslim law, and may even dictate themselves what the law should and should not be. So it's often the ulama, and even more specifically the jurists, in the absence of explicit direction in the Quran or from the life of Muhammad, who give direction to Muslims and guide Islamic societies. Now, with that all being said, I think it's time to bring in Iran. Iranians, as an organized people with a distinct culture and political identity, have conservatively about 2,500 years of history, about 1,200 of which, nearly half of it, predates Islam. They were typically held together by a king, in Iran called a Shah. Shahs, it was believed, had a kingly charisma, a far, radiating from them, that bestowed upon them the right to rule. But if a Shah failed at the art of governing, the Shah would lose his charisma and would ultimately, one way or another, be deposed. Such beliefs contributed to a turbulent political history for Iran, with many different empires with varying degrees of power and success rising and falling, held together by leaders with varying beliefs. At the time, there were no modern states that could impose a singular language and culture, as we have now. So Iran, as elsewhere, was in reality composed of a patchwork of languages and cultures. But there was still a general culture of Iranianness that cohered through the centuries and through the tumult, held together by a common language, as well as a sense of identity through cultural pride, backed by a penchant for literacy and innovation, and even a cultural love of art, most notably a love of poetry. The name Iran itself seems to have an ancient etymological tie to the concept of nobility, and is the name that people living there, for most of its history, used. The terms Persia and Persians come from a specific ancient group of Iranians. When Iranians went to war with the Greeks in 5th century BC, the Greeks used that name and called them all Persians, and the term, mostly for the outside world, became how they were known until the mid-20th century. Its dominant ancient religion, often called Mazdaism in its earlier forms, and Zoroastrianism in its later forms, seems to have been a strong influence on the Abrahamic religions that replaced it, with its concepts of heaven and hell, of free human choice between good and evil, of divine judgment, of angels, and of a single creator God. Its founder, Zoroaster, also called Zarathustra, has been argued by thinkers as prominent as Friedrich Nietzsche to be the first popular proponent of the moral world that we live in, a world where morality is framed as a struggle between good and evil. Islam came to Iran in the 7th century AD, when Muslim leaders after Muhammad spread it in a vast empire across the Middle East called the Caliphate. When it was spread through jihad into Iran, it was undoubtedly already familiar in a sense to Iranians. Through a mix of organic conversions, forced conversions, and political purges, Islam quickly became the predominant religion in Iran. For about the next 900 years, the question wasn't whether or not Iran was Islamic, and that its people were overwhelmingly Muslim, and that its rulers were, at least to some extent, guided by Islam. But instead the question became, what type of Islam would prevail in Iran? The Prophet Muhammad had stressed the importance of the unity of Muslims, but upon his death, their unity fractured over the question of secession. From that came two large factions: the Sunnis, who accepted the line of secession as it actually happened, and the Shias, who rallied behind a different successor they believed the Prophet had named, his cousin and son-in-law Ali, which meant that Ali's succession for the Shias was, at least for the time, unjustly denied by the Sunnis. That led to a strict understanding among Shias about who can and cannot lead Muslim communities, with their two choices typically being family members of the Prophet Muhammad, or, in the absence of that, the ulama, who could also be called the clergy. Iran also had a strong tradition of Sufism, which emphasized one's own personal ability to build a spiritual connection with the Quran and with God, which often used poetry and dance in an attempt to heighten one's faculties of perception. Though they may have had their conflicts in Iran throughout the centuries, these various strains more or less coexisted. Modern state apparatus had not yet developed, and the ability of leaders to impose their will on an entire society was quite limited. The Sharia, for example, may have been emphasized here and there, but leaders had no ability to impose it as law on the whole population, with anything like the thoroughness that we'd recognize today. Furthermore, Iran was prone to political upheavals. It was invaded, conquered, fractured, coming together again, only to break back apart. But as modernity approached, things changed. In the early 16th century, a family called the Safavids, led by a man named Ismail, were able to overthrow regional leaders and bring all of Iran under their control. They originally spoke Turkish and were Sunni, but to the surprise and the fascination of the Muslim world, Ismail converted to Shi'ism and officially declared Shi'ism, at the time very much a minority view, as the state religion of Iran, a religion by royal decree that was to be imposed on his subjects, now required, at the pain of death, to curse the early Sunni leaders. Whoever disobeys, the decree said, he is to be beheaded. Shias had long been a persecuted minority in the Muslim world, but they now saw in Iran a place to make a relatively safe abode of Islam in their own image. Shia jurists from all over traveled to Iran, showing up by the dozens in Safavid courts. They developed a symbiotic relationship with their shahs. They would provide religious guidance and legitimacy to the state, and would typically look the other way if the shahs didn't listen to their guidance. And the shahs, in turn, used the state to elevate the ulama, making them the new elite of Iranian society. As this went on, Iran became the first major, stable Shia state, and the leading example of Shi'ism within the Muslim world, a distinction that was true in its time, and is still true down to the present day. In that climate, Shi'ism developed, and a new type of Islam emerged. Through a royal decree by the second Shah, Tahmasp, the Safavid state endorsed the principle of taqlid, which means imitation. Shias would, at least in theory, have the freedom to choose their own high-ranking cleric to look up to, called a mojtahid, but then would be obligated to live their life in a way that imitated that mojtahid, making Shia society now, in theory, directed by the clergy in a top-down fashion, as they directed Shias how to live their life as they believed God willed it. As they continued to elaborate on Shi'ism, the clergy became interested in ritualizing basically all aspects of human life. A popular tract, for example, gave direction on proper Muslim clothing, eating, drinking, bathing, personal hygiene, scatology, sex, child-rearing, education, marriage, parenting, animal rearing, buying, selling, and commerce. Between the power of the state and the direction of the ulama, it was thought, God's will could be achieved. An entire society could be made Muslim, and a unified form of Muslim in Shi'ism. And the ulama could direct that society, telling people how to live, or how not to live, as they believed God willed it. By the end of the Safavid dynasty, official orders had gone out to close taverns, coffee houses, brothels, to ban prostitution, opium, colorful herbs, sodomy, public music, dancing and gambling. Women were to stay at home, to behave modestly, and were forbidden to mix with men who were not relatives. Islamic dress was to be worn. But it was an ideal that they never fully realized. Despite the bans, drinking, gambling, and smoking, for example, were widespread. The Safavids themselves flagrantly flouted the conservatism of the ulama, perhaps best captured by a mural of a harem in the royal court. But perhaps most importantly, through the imposition of Shi'ism and through the suppression of rival sects and religions, Iran came together. At the cost of ideological diversity, it became stable and unified. After the chaos of the initial repressions, Iranians generally came to look favorably on their state, experiencing sustained strength, prosperity, and peace. When the Safavids fell after well over 200 years in power, they were, at the time, the longest-lasting dynasty in the history of Islamic Iran, creating a long memory for Iranians that would be cherished going forward. But as Iran was experimenting with fusing Shi'ism with the state, the European world was going in the other direction, developing a doctrine of separation of church and state. It was also, of course, a power that was rapidly rising, undergoing scientific and industrial revolutions. Iran broke apart after the Safavids, and only came together as a Shia state again under the Qajars. But as it did, it found itself challenged by the outside world. Europe had, quite suddenly, so far overtaken the Qajars that they had no hope of competing, politically, industrially, or militarily. A once proud people had fallen behind. A part of the world that was once considered backwards to Iranians could now dominate them and treat them with contempt. Shia Islam during the Qajar period was, in a sense, stronger than ever, as the Qajars, using a more modern state apparatus, were able to impose Sharia law to a significant degree on Iranian society. But the period, overall, was typically seen as one of decline for Iranians, as the Qajars presided over a troubled economy and a corrupt government laden with debt. That created stresses and fractures in Iranian society, as people criticized their Islamic status quo and looked for alternatives, ones that could bring Iran, one way or another, competitively into modernity. Many, especially in its capital, Tehran, looked to Europe, to liberalism, and to Western models of government, which culminated in 1906 in the Constitutional Revolution, a popular protest against the Shah, calling for reforms, which gave Iran its first constitution, and at least in principle rule of law, and limited the power of the Shah with separate organs of government, which gave them a parliamentary system, with the parliament, called the Majlis, and a prime minister. The revolution exemplified peaceful, pluralistic reform in Iran, creating a government that was partially secular and partially Islamic. But the project of reform stalled in Iran, partially from infighting between Iranians, but also significantly from interference from the outside world. Interference that began in the 19th century, but crescendoed in the 20th, starting with the decision of Britain and Russia, in the lead-up to World War I, to split Iran into separate spheres of influence. During the First World War, Iran was in a fragile state and tried to maintain neutrality, a neutrality that the combatants ignored, using Iran, its land and resources, for their own purposes. The war caused widespread suffering in Iran, famine, disease, and regional chaos. To bring order to Iran and to counter Russian influence after the Russian Revolution, the British, at least to some extent, helped a rising colonel named Reza Khan stage a military coup, through which he eventually became Shah in 1926, making him now Reza Shah. With that came a new dynasty, the Pahlavis, consisting of him and his son that was to follow him, Mohammad Reza Shah. Both tried to lead Iran through a philosophy of secular nationalism, which is the idea that Iranians should organize around a principle of shared national identity, outside of religion and outside of any other prevailing ideology. Both had what's usually called a strongman style of rule, curtailing civil liberties as was seen as necessary, and frequently jailing or even killing political opposition. Reza Khan set the tone coming into power by putting up notices across Tehran, telling the public to be quiet and obedient to military commands. Martial law was in effect, it was announced, and all press and publications were banned, among other restrictions. Both Pahlavis saw Iranian Shi'ism as a historical aberration, an affliction that was holding Iran back, keeping it out of modernity, an attitude that was sometimes expressed in naked contempt. Reza Shah, for example, dealt with a dispute with an Ayatollah, which is a widely respected cleric, by entering his shrine without his boots on, whipping him, and arresting him. Mohammad Reza Shah, for his part, reportedly told one author that the Shia establishment were a bunch of lice-ridden, dirty old men. Both Pahlavis, accordingly, implemented secular reforms in Iran, pulling Iranian politics away from the influence of Islam, for example by banning the hijab under Reza Shah and implementing women's suffrage under Mohammad Reza Shah. The Quran, by any traditional reading, calls for a patriarchal society. Men and women have similar rights, it says, but men are a degree above women. It also might be worth pointing out that when it's speaking on the differences between genders, it's clearly speaking to men. Men are you, and women are an othered they, them. So Islamic societies are, I think, virtually always patriarchal. Men hold political power and dictate policy to women, which again they believe is a state of affairs that has been dictated to them by God. So a strong clerical opposition grew against the implementation of women's suffrage in Iran, an opposition headed by a man named Ruhollah Khomeini, a charismatic, outspoken, and politically savvy cleric who believed that the Shah's policies were weakening the role of clerics and that of Islam in society. Meanwhile, throughout their roughly 50 years of power, both Pahlavis focused on trying to modernize Iran in terms of its trade, infrastructure, government institutions, and relationship with the rest of the world. And to a large extent, they actually succeeded. But the strongman style of rule from the Pahlavis eventually eroded their support in Iran, something that began under Reza Shah and reached a climax under Mohammad Reza Shah. Mohammad Reza Shah came into power in the context of the Second World War in 1941. Iran again tried to stay neutral in the war, but the British and Russians again ignored it and occupied Iran, wanting on one hand to keep its vast oil supplies away from the Germans, and wanting on the other a land corridor to supply relief to Russia, which was in the middle of a German invasion. Not trusting Reza Shah to fully cooperate, they, now in a position of power, forced him to abdicate and replaced him with his son, the young Mohammed. The new Shah, at first, held less power than his father, and popular politics, with their parties and leading politicians, saw a rise in Iran. With that came extremes, the loudest of which were a far-left Tudeh party, inspired by the Soviet Union, and a militant group called Fadayan Islam, which frequently used terror, intimidation, and assassinations to combat the enemies of Islam. In the politically tumultuous 10 years that were to follow, Iran went through 17 prime ministers, with none lasting more than a year. Meanwhile, Britain and Russia continued to dominate it, the latter occupying it for several years after the war. Britain, after many generations of interventions, had a monopoly on Iran's oil reserves, keeping most for itself and only giving Iran around 16% of the royalties, on which they had to pay taxes. The US, until that point, had mostly remained aloof from Iran, but began making overtures to them, genuinely seeming like a power that wanted to act in their best interests. To many Iranians, this seemed like the power that they had long waited for, a power that would finally help them without politically dominating them. But then the cause of oil nationalization became popular in Iran, championed by their popular prime minister, Mossadegh. At the time, Iran supplied more than 20% of the world's oil, and the thought of losing that much oil to a potential nationalization program was too much in particular for the British to bear. Britain responded with its allies by blockading Iran's oil exports. Mossadegh's government responded by breaking diplomatic relations with Britain, and Britain then turned to convince the United States to overthrow Mossadegh's government. The US was increasingly concerned about the rise of the Soviet-friendly Tudeh party in Iran, and when Eisenhower came into office in 1953, the British found an administration that was willing to take a harder line internationally. Working together, using the MI6 and the CIA, they engineered Operation Ajax, a coup d'etat that successfully threw Mossadegh out of power, and established Mohammad Reza Shah as an autocrat in Iran. And with that, having overthrown their government, the United States suddenly became the dominant foreign power in Iran, and the focus of Iran's significantly pent up, and you could say justified, anti-imperialist anxieties. Iran nationalized and stabilized its oil industry, and Iran's economy grew significantly under Mohammad Reza Shah. But there were benefits felt mostly by the wealthy, especially leaving the urban poor and rural Iranians behind. Throughout the 60s and 70s, an Iran emerged that many in the West would recognize. A society with higher education being achieved by both men and women. A society with a thriving film scene, with contemporary music. And increasingly, especially in cities, contemporary liberal dress, even for women. But these developments had their critics, and a conservative, especially Islamic backlash formed. Many began openly proclaiming that Iran was sick. It was afflicted by the West, popularized in the term West toxication. As criticism against the Shah rose, he found little in the way of domestic support. He became, over time, even more of an autocrat than his father, banning political parties, persecuting opposition, and essentially terrorizing Iranians with his much-hated secret police. As Mohammad Reza Shah's popularity fell, he was increasingly forced to rely on his military to stay in power, a military largely procured from Americans. Relatively small events now could cause widespread protests in Iran. When the United States, citing Iran's weak state of law, demanded the right for its nationals in Iran to be tried with American law, Iran erupted with outrage. Again at the forefront of the protests was Ruhollah Khomeini. He said, "They have reduced the Iranian people to a level lower than that of an American dog. If someone runs over a dog belonging to an American, he will be prosecuted. Even if the Shah himself were to run over a dog belonging to an American, he would be prosecuted. But if an American cook runs over the Shah, the head of state, no one will have the right to interfere with him." Khomeini was exiled from Iran following those comments. But far from making him disappear, the exile allowed him to continue to criticize the Shah, now from a safe distance, while also developing his own ideas that he could now preach freely to his loyal following. He began to dream not just of overthrowing the Shah, but of establishing a new society in Iran, a society that was an innovation for Iran and for Shi'ism. He established his thoughts in a series of lectures, which were then compiled into a book called Islamic Government, alternatively called Guardianship of the Jurists. He opened his argument by saying that Muslims have long been misled by anti-Islamic propaganda. It was propaganda that came from Jews and other groups, as he put it, who were, in certain respects, more satanic than them. They placed agents all through society, in religious centers, universities, publishing houses. All these people, he said, have pooled their energies in an effort to distort the principles of Islam. Because of that, he thought, Muslims were misguided, and Khomeini set out to right them. Islam, he said, is the religion of militant individuals who are committed to truth and justice. It is the religion of those who desire freedom and independence. It is the school of those who struggle against imperialism. He argued that Iran had been poisoned by vice brought in from imperialism, from Britain, France, Belgium, and most recently, America. Sexual vice in particular, he said, is reaching such proportions that it's destroying entire generations, corrupting our youth and causing them to neglect all forms of work. The traditional Shia view, until that point, was that the only legitimate religious head of state was a family member of the Prophet Muhammad, called an imam. The last known imam, they believed, did not die, but disappeared from human sight, to reappear one day as a sort of judgment day for humanity. The Shia clergy were thought to have the right to lead in the absence of that, but to do it in a way that had a limited relationship with government. For example, by serving as advisors to the head of state. Khomeini called that traditional view hostile propaganda and put forward his own vision of Islam, Because Shias believe that Muhammad appointed a successor who would have led Muslims and would have done so in accordance with God's will, then Shias must also believe that it's necessary for them now to establish a government. We must strive to establish organs for the execution of law and the administration of affairs, he said. Know that it is your duty to establish an Islamic government. This would be a government with a far reach into Iranian society, protecting it from social, intellectual, and moral corruption, and thus imparting order to all the affairs of the country. But that government needs leadership, and the role of leadership, he says, should fall to the ulama, and even more specifically, the jurists, the fuqaha. Since Islamic government is a government of law, he said, those acquainted with the law, or more precisely with religion, i.e. the fuqaha, must supervise its functioning. It is they who supervise all executive and administrative affairs of the country, together with all the planning. The just fuqaha must be leaders and rulers. It was a radical idea, even for the Shia clergy, as their jurists had never held a role like that in Islamic history. But Shias were feeling repressed in Iran. Popular sentiment was turning against the Shah, and a revolutionary potential was in the air. Khomeini positioned himself as the man willing to stand in front of all that, the man willing to speak out against the Shah and spearhead the formation of a new Iran. But the details of what that Iran would look like, precisely, were left quite vague. After publishing Islamic Government, Khomeini studiously avoided speaking to his own political goals, instead preferring generic catchphrases that appealed to different groups of Iranians. Islam is for equality and social justice, he said. Islam will eliminate class differences. The duty of the clergy is to liberate the hungry from the clutches of the rich. In interviews, he always played down the subject of clerical rule, which was of course his thesis in the Islamic Government lectures, often claiming no ambitions for such a position, and instead describing a vision for Iran that was much more moderate and politically inclusive.
جای شاه یک حکومت عدل اسلامی، حکومت دموکراسی به تمام معنا.
Increasing numbers of Iranians began to demonstrate, from a broad range of ideological groups, united by their shared antipathy for the Shah and the desire for Iran to be free from foreign influence, and from the United States in particular. Violence broke out on both sides of the protests, and the protests just grew, bigger and bigger. As this went on, more and more attention was brought onto Khomeini, who at the time was in France, as he was widely perceived as the head of this rising Iranian revolution. The Shah tried to ease pressure by appeasing the rising opposition, an appeasement that, in the eyes of many Iranians, made him look weak. When the military, the Shah's last bastion of safety, made it clear that they wouldn't act to support the Shah fled the country, paving the way for Khomeini to return, which he did on February 1st, 1979, a return which was greeted by the celebrations of millions. An ecstatic public now calling Khomeini the Imam. The Shah had fled and the military had stood down, and the ground was set for a new governing order in Iran. But what would that order be? The answer was far from clear. It was an answer that would be resolved through power struggle. Iran had, for a time, two governments, both provisional. One left behind by the Shah, and the other put together by the revolutionaries, headed by a prime minister appointed by Khomeini. Khomeini quickly came to regret the lack of radicalism in the prime minister, but at first expressed his support. And in expressing his support, he, for the first time in 10 years, teased at the authoritarianism that was about to come, saying, "As a man who, through the guardianship that I have from the holy lawgiver, the prophet, I hereby pronounce Bazargan as the ruler, and since I have appointed him, he must be obeyed. The nation must obey him. This is not an ordinary government. It is a government based on the Sharia. Opposing this government means opposing the Sharia of Islam and revolting against the Sharia. And revolt against the government of the Sharia has its punishment in our law. It is a heavy punishment in Islamic jurisprudence. Revolt against God's government is a revolt against God. Revolt against God is blasphemy." The Shah's government had very little support and quickly dissolved. The revolutionary government, similarly, had little in the way of power. As the Prime Minister put it, in theory, the government is in charge, but in reality, it is Khomeini who is in charge. He, with his Revolutionary Council, his revolutionary committees, and his relationship with the masses. The government, nonetheless, put forward a constitution, one that didn't include a position for clerical rule, and one that would have, more or less, allowed democratic politics to take place. Whatever chance it had of passing, maybe none, it quickly became irrelevant. The Shah revealed he was dying from cancer, a type of cancer that required modern facilities to treat. As he was rejected by one country after another, the US, a country now called the Great Satan by Khomeini, decided to admit him into their country and into treatment. Iranians loyal to Khomeini, believing, apparently falsely, that the US was plotting another coup, responded by storming the American embassy and taking its employees hostage, thus creating the Iranian hostage crisis.
In the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful, the hostages are in our hands, and we protect them strongly. And we are ready so that in the case of any military intervention, we will destroy them.
It was an unprecedented move in international relations, but Khomeini stood behind it. It was a move that isolated Iran from the world stage, as it was increasingly being seen internationally as a rogue state. But it boosted Khomeini's popularity at home, as Iran was reinvigorated with a revolutionary fervor. Feeling powerless, the prime minister resigned, and his government fell with him, leaving Khomeini free to put forward his own constitution. The constitution was based on two conflicting principles. One was the authority of the people, expressed through democratic processes, such as elections and a newly created presidential post. And the other was the authority of God, which, expressed in real terms, meant the authority of the Shia clergy. But they weren't principles held in balance with one another. Because crucially, sitting at the very top of the pyramid of power in Iran, stemming from a clause deep in the Iranian constitution and established in somewhat abstract language, is a position called the Velayat Faqih, the guardian jurist, also called the supreme leader, to be held by the leading Marja al-Taqlid, the clerical source of imitation. Beyond exercising direct control over officials beneath them, for example by controlling state media, the police, or the military, the supreme leader dominates Iranian politics through control of the judicial, which means they have power over the Supreme Court and over the organs of law in Iran in general. The supreme leader, also importantly, controls Iran's popular institutions like the Majlis and the presidency through the Guardian Council, a historically ultra-conservative body of 12, 6 of whom are directly appointed by the supreme leader, who have the power to filter unwanted candidates out of the presidency and out of the Majlis, and also veto unwanted laws passed by the Majlis, giving Iranians institutionally limited power through popular processes. Written into the constitution itself is the imposition of Muslim morality, at least to some extent, on the populace, saying, in the Islamic Republic of Iran, inviting one to good, the promotion of virtue, and the prohibition of vice is a general and concomitant responsibility of the people toward one another, the government toward the people, and the people toward the government. The conditions, boundaries, and nature of this relationship are set by the law. To justify it, they quote a passage from the Quran that we've read earlier. It was put to a vote that many Iranians abstained from, but still, a vote that resoundingly passed. With the passage of the Constitution came the Islamic Republic of Iran. A relatively modern state with significant oil revenues was now controlled by Shia clerics. Khomeini assumed the position of supreme leader of Iran and defended it by saying, it is right that the supreme religious authority should oversee the work of the president and other state officials to make sure they don't make mistakes or go against the law and the Quran. Power struggles would continue, and it would take some time for this to play out. But Iran had, in effect, become a theocratic state, a religiously oriented autocracy. After the revolution, Khomeini broke further with Islamic tradition by insisting on what he called a unity of expression, which meant in practice that there would be limited dissent from the supreme leader allowed within the clergy, and even less dissent allowed outside the clergy. What followed then was a widespread purge across Iran, often framed as a moral cleansing. Political executions skyrocketed, targeting a wide range of people, labeled as counter-revolutionaries, who were sowing corruption on earth. Political blocs, one after the other, were labeled as apostates, or were accused of being in league with the Americans and were suppressed. Militia groups like the Hezbollah, the Party of God, enforced Khomeini's will in the streets. Almost all independent newspapers were closed. The education system was made Islamically correct. Executions began for what were seen as strong violations of the Sharia. When asked about a boy shot for sodomy, possibly homosexuality, Khomeini responded, "Corruption, corruption. We have to eliminate corruption." Prostitutes were literally burned in what were seen as purifying flames. Iranians that could not or did not want to live in an Islamic state left in a mass exodus, typically from the middle class. It was a tumultuous state of affairs, one that Khomeini and the clergy might not have survived had Saddam Hussein not invaded in 1980, uniting Iran behind Khomeini in the Iran-Iraq War. But survive they did. By the end of the decade, as Khomeini was dying and the mantle was being passed to his successor, Khamenei, the clergy had stabilized and retained a commanding position over Iranian politics. In the Islamic Republic, law officially is derived from Islam and the Sharia, which means that the law imposed on Iranian nationals, to some extent, is based on Muslim morality. That's at the very heart of what separates it from secular governments, like that of the United States. In the United States, law is imposed on you by virtue of being an American citizen, but it's, at least by and large, secular law, arrived at through rational principles and implemented for practical purposes. In contrast to that, by virtue of being born in Iran, you have, in addition to practical laws, a body of religious laws imposed on you. Laws literally arrived at through the power of belief, through faith. Laws that Muslims believe command one to be good and forbid one from doing evil. Laws on morality that, even more specifically, are determined by a single man, the supreme leader, and by extension, his ruling elite. An elite that, since the revolution, have decisively fallen on the conservative end of Islamic political thought. The laws cover a wide range of topics, from drinking to adultery, but probably their most controversial issues regard their laws on women. Women kept their right to vote in the Islamic Republic, but in many other ways became, legally speaking, second-class citizens. For example, by being held out of top-ranking jobs in the government, losing rights of custody in the event of a divorce, and needing permission from husbands or fathers in order to travel. Women, sexually speaking, are also controlled by the Iranian government. Islam emphasizes the prevention of sin more than the forgiveness of sin, and traditionally sees it as a woman's duty, primarily, to prevent sexual sin, namely sex outside of marriage, a sin that's illegal and even punishable by death in Iran. Women, therefore, are legally required to behave modestly and dress modestly, therefore not arousing men's sexuality and inevitably creating sin, which again is namely sex outside of marriage. The legal mandate for women to cover their hair with a hijab is widely focused on as the most visibly apparent symbol of that. A religious duty, women were told, upon which was erected the foundation of the Islamic Revolution. It might be worth saying, however obvious it might be, that for some, this is an eminently desirable state of affairs. Iranians have achieved, they believe, a thoroughly Islamic society, one where the holiest of men lead their society through strongly fortified chain of command. In their view, they no longer have an insufficiently Islamic despot at their helm, and they're no longer at the mercy of being manipulated by foreign powers. With the Islamic Republic, they're in power, finally independent, and even fairly stable. But it's a state of affairs that has been achieved through repression. More repression even than what Iran experienced by and large through the Pahlavis. Iran has become fairly stable, but it's a stability achieved through forced homogeneity, creating probably the least pluralistic society that Iran has ever experienced. Official doctrine holds that the Islamic Republic is God's government, and those who go against the government go against God and are therefore heretics. They're often additionally described as being foreign agents and are accordingly repressed. So for all the virtues this society has, for some, for others, this is a profoundly tyrannical state of affairs, especially for those who don't agree with this particular form of morality that's being imposed on them. Questions exist. What is the place of Islam in the modern world? Should Islamic morality be mandated or voluntary? Should it be a social force or a political force, even a bureaucratic one? Who are Iranians? Are they a national group, a religious group, or both? If Iranians were to adopt an alternative, what is it? In an isolated country where speech against the government is labeled as foreign and heretical, the answer is hard to formulate. If the status quo is desirable, what is to be done with the dissenters? How far can the Iranian state go while still remaining just? If change is desirable, is peaceful reform an option? Or, if not, then what? Such questions push and pull the Iranian polity, giving rise to drama. Drama, true throughout its history, and still true today.